Hello everyone, and welcome to another video. Today we are going to be talking about voting and elections. Now, in case you've been living under a rock the past few weeks, we had one of these not too long ago, and I think now would be a good time to go over the election process. Tomorrow I'm planning on talking about the Electoral College, so I feel like this is a well-timed lesson for what's been going on in our country as of late. So let's go ahead and get started with this. Now the first thing I want to show you is this neat little animation here. What this is showing you is the presidential election results by party. Now if you pay attention to the bottom here, bottom part of this animation, it shows you all of the different parties that have existed throughout our, well, most of them, I won't say all of the ones that really posed any sort of, had a substantial following throughout our history. So it's kind of just interesting to watch how the states change over time on what candidate they, or what party I should say, they support, and just kind of shows the growing of the country over time. And it's just interesting to see how one-sided some elections are, whereas some are very highly contested. Next up is the election process. In the United States, the election process occurs in two steps. Now we're going to be talking mostly about the presidential election, but this goes for other offices as well. The first step is nomination, in which the field of candidates is narrowed. So there's a lot of people that will run for a certain office. If you remember in last year, whenever the Democrats were figuring out who their candidate was going to be to run against Donald Trump, if you remember back then, there were a lot of different candidates. And the nomination process is how they get that narrowed down to who the party is going to run. And then the second part is the general election, where voters make the final choice of office holder. Now the general election is the election that we just had last week. Whenever I talk about a specific election, I'm going to mostly refer to the 2016 election, because that is the election that we have firm final results for. If you've been paying attention to the news, you know that the election that we just had is still being contested by some people. I'm not really going to get into that. There's still a lot of things being figured out and finalized. Depending on who you ask, it may already be finalized, but like I said, I'm not going to get into that in this video. I'm going to wait until we have a firm answer before I really talk about it. So we're going to just talk about the process in general. The nomination process. There are three ways a candidate can be nominated for the ballot. One is self-announcement. A person who wants to run for office announces their candidacy. Whenever a write-in candidate appears on the ballot, the self-announcement process has been used. So you can just run for an office without the party officials' support. Now, to my knowledge, there hasn't really been any serious candidates that really took office through this manner, but it is something that you can do. The second is petition. Candidates are nominated by means of petitions signed by a certain number of qualified voters in a district. So if enough people join together and they want a certain candidate on the ballot, they can petition to have that person on there. Now, with the person's support and approval, right? They can't really force a person to be a candidate, but if enough people join together and they all petition to have one person's name added to the ballot, they can do that. And the third is a caucus. This is originally a private meeting of local bigwigs. The caucus was a nominating device that fell out of favor in the 1820s, but is used in Iowa. So if you ever hear about the Iowa caucus, This used to be more widespread. Iowa is the only state that still uses this, but they don't use it anymore. The Iowa caucuses. This is the first major contest of the presidential primary season. Iowans gather at a local caucus meeting to discuss and vote on the candidates. Okay, so the reason that the Iowa caucus is given such attention is of the primary season of the primary election. This is the first one that happens, just due to when it happens time-wise. Now let's talk about primary election versus general election. A primary election, and for this video we will just talk about the presidential election. A primary election is where the party decides on a state-by-state basis who the candidate is going to be to run for the office of president. So in the last primary election that we had, the Republican, if you were a Republican, you essentially were going to vote for Donald Trump because he was running for re-election. He was really the only candidate that was supported by the Republican Party. And typically, if a president is running for re-election, he's the candidate for their party. The Democrats, on the other side, had a number of candidates to vote for, and that way you can have two winners from each state, depending on party affiliation. So back at the end of President Obama's candidacy, or at the end of his presidential term, after he had served his 8 years, there were Republicans and Democrats both running for the office of the president because President Obama had served 2 terms. He could not run again. So there were winners in each state in the primary election for each. There were 2 winners for each state. There was a Republican winner and a Democrat winner. So due to the way that the votes go in the state, they determine who the candidate is going to be. Now, not all states have the same rules for a primary election. Not all states' primary elections happen at the same time. That is why the earlier contests, the earlier primary elections that happen in different states are given a lot more attention, because if there's one really strong candidate that really just sweeps the early primary elections, the ones that happen later on may not even be relevant. They may already have gotten enough support that the rest of the states really doesn't matter because they had already gotten enough votes. So the earlier that the primary election happened, the more attention it's given, by the news and by nationwide attention. Petition. Candidates must gather a required number of voter signatures to get on the ballot by means of petition. Now, independent and minor party candidates are usually required by state law to be nominated by petition. And this is on a state-by-state basis. So if, let's say that I wanted to be on the ballot next year, or not next year, next election, we would have to have enough people that decided that they wanted me on the ballot to sign a petition and then petition the state to have me added to the ballot. Petition is often used at the local level to nominate for school posts in municipal offices. So the petition process is typically more often used at a local level, so it's not really used at the national level that often. The direct primary. Now, there are different types of direct primaries. There is the closed primary, which only declared party members can vote. So if you are a person that declines to choose a political party, which that is within your right to do, at that time you will be known as what's called an independent. And if your state has a closed primary, you don't get to vote in that primary election. Now, remember, we're just talking about primary. You still get to vote in the general election, where the final office holder is decided, the election we just had last week. But in the primary, if you are an independent voter, you don't get to vote. Now there's also what's called an open primary, and any qualified voter can take part. This is also known as a blanket primary, and qualified voters can vote for any candidate regardless of party. So in a closed primary, whatever party you are registered as, when you get your ballot, you are only going to have your party's candidates on there. If you are registered as a Democrat, you are not going to see any Republicans on your ballot. If you are registered Republican, you are not going to see any Democrats on your ballot. So that's kind of the difference there. There is a runoff primary. If a required majority is not met, the two people with the most votes run again. So in a runoff primary, which has happened, if that is the kind of primary that you have, and no one candidate gets enough votes to secure the election, or to secure the primary, then you have to have another election. But instead of having a whole list of candidates, it's only the two that got the most votes. Nonpartisan primary. Candidates are not identified by party labels. Now, if you paid attention to the assignment I gave you last week about George Washington's farewell address, you would probably guess that that is the one that George Washington would prefer. And in a nonpartisan primary, you will get all of the candidates for the office that you're voting for, and they will not be identified by party labels. Okay, so this is how the different primaries are held in the United States. As you can see, West Virginia has a closed primary, meaning that whenever you go to vote, you're only going to see candidates from your party on the ballot, and unaffiliated voters are permitted to vote. So that's how that works there. All right, types of votes. There is the popular vote. The votes cast directly by constituents or voters. So whenever you go and you vote, whenever they start to tally up all the votes, there will be what's called the popular vote, and there will be what is called the electoral vote. Now, in the 2016 presidential election, President Trump got 62,984,825 votes, whereas Hillary Clinton got 65,853,516 votes. Now, it doesn't take a high-level math person to look at those and say, well, Clinton got more votes, why didn't she win? The popular vote within each state decides the electoral votes, and the electoral votes are what you need to win. The electoral votes differ in each state, with each state having electoral votes equal to the number of representatives and senators. So, each state has 2 senators, and then the number of representatives is dependent on population. So, in the Senate, West Virginia has 2 senators. California has 2 senators. Now, California is a much bigger state than West Virginia. Didn't know if you knew that. So, whenever it comes to representatives, West Virginia has 3, California has 55. That is just due to the number of, it's just due to the population of the state. The presidency is won by the candidate who gets the majority of the electoral votes, and that means at least 270. 270 is that key. 270 is that key number that a candidate has to get in order to win the presidency. Once they get 270 electoral votes, that's it. They win. If all of the states haven't been decided by then, once a candidate gets 270 votes, the rest of the votes doesn't matter. If a candidate gets to 270, if another candidate takes all the rest of the votes, they're not going to get more than 270. So that is why 270 is the key number. If you were tracking the recent election. One website that is often used is called 270 to win. That's why they got that name. 270 is the electoral votes that you need to win. Now, if you're still a little bit confused about the Electoral College, come back tomorrow. I'm going to have a video about the Electoral College. Hopefully it kind of clears up any questions you have. A lot of people, and don't feel embarrassed if you aren't really understanding the Electoral College, a lot of people get really confused about it, and there's a lot of different opinions out there about it. So we'll talk more about that tomorrow. You might look at these numbers here for President Trump and Hillary Clinton and say, well, that doesn't seem right. If more people wanted Hillary Clinton to be president, why didn't she win? Well, we'll get into that. Like I said, we'll get into that tomorrow. Voter behavior. Idiot comes from the Greek word idiotes, those who did not contribute to politics and the community. Voter turnout in the United States in 2018, it was 53%. 53% of people who could vote came out and voted. But you might think, well, that was an off-year election, and it was the highest turnout in 4 decades. Now, most people, whenever they vote, they're really only interested in the presidential election. But we have elections every year for different offices. Not every office has a 4-year term. Representatives have 2-year terms. Senators have 6-year terms. So, in these off years where a new president isn't being elected, typically turnout is lower. So 2018 was 53%. You might think, oh, well, that's over half. Well, that was actually the highest off-year election turnout in 4 decades, 40 years. In 2016, that was the year that was between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. 55% of voters came out. Whereas in 2014, it was an off-year election, 36%. If you ever hear people say, oh, well, my vote doesn't matter, my vote doesn't matter. Well, look, in 2014, only 36% of people came out and voted. That's a little over a third of the country was all that came out to vote. So think about that. That means that 64% of the people were like, oh, my vote doesn't matter. Well, 64% is a huge amount that could really decide an election. 2012 was another presidential election year. 60% came out. And 2008, 63% came out to vote. So, as you can tell, the years that we have a presidential election, more people vote because more people are invested in that election. Reasons for not voting. There are a lot of people that have elections or have opinions on voting. Reasons for not voting: physically unable, sick, out of town, too busy, at work, etc. Things happen. But if you are not going to be able to vote on election day, you can do what's called an absentee ballot. If you're going to be out of the country, or if I have a doctor's appointment that day, I can't go, you can request what's called an absentee ballot, and you fill it out ahead of time, and then you turn it in. There are people that don't trust the electoral system and feel their vote makes no difference. Well, if you don't vote, of course your vote's not going to matter. Non-voters tend to be younger, under 35. Typically, young people have the lowest turnout rates, but that has changed in recently. Younger voters have started coming out and voting in current and more recent elections. So that is a good trend that I hope all of you will continue. Unmarried people tend to not vote, and people who have a lower education level who tend to not care about politics. Males. Men tend to be non-voters, but I will proudly say that I have voted in every election that I have been of legal age to vote in. and people who live in rural areas. Now, this may be due to access. I remember I grew up in Proctor, West Virginia. If you know Proctor, you know that is a very, very rural area, and it took me, a good half an hour to drive to where I would vote. So it can be a limiting factor, especially if you don't have a way to get around. And people who are low income. If you're a low income person, maybe you work multiple jobs to try to make ends meet. You can't get off work to vote. It happens. Now, who can't vote? If you look at this map, there are different rules. Anyone under 18. If you're under 18, you can't vote. Sorry. Specifics are left to the states but are overseen by the federal government. And some convicted of a felony crime can lose their right to vote. Now, that last, there are people that have started to contest that last rule there in the modern day. There hasn't really been a change currently. If you have committed a felony crime, you can't vote, but that may change in the coming years. There are people who think that, after a person has committed a crime, if they have, served their time in prison or whatever their punishment was deemed to be, and they're back as a part of society, why shouldn't they be able to vote? There are people that believe that. I'll leave your opinion up to you. Okay guys, that's going to be it for this video. If you have any questions, you can leave them as a comment, send me a message on Schoology or an email, what have you. Like I said, tomorrow we are going to talk about the Electoral College. I know a lot of people get really confused and stressed out by that process, so hopefully I'll be able to clear up any questions you might have. I'll see you again real soon. I hope everybody's having a great day.